this series on new discoveries at the intersection of science and religion with the quantum nature of the universe. And the reason the quantum nature of the universe, this happens to be a shot of a portion of the universe that's in the presence of a black hole. Quantum is important not only because it's such a fundamental theory that explains so much of the natural world, but because of all the great theories beginning with Newton's law and Maxwell's equations of electrodynamics. The quantum has built into it a kind of mystery and a kind of freedom that, as beautiful as the classical equations of motion are, they are completely deterministic. Once you set them in motion, they're going to give you exactly the same thing every time, starting from some initial state. So the only thing that you can change in the universe of the classical world is the initial condition. But once you give that, it's like a video. Like a video. It just plays. It's all done. It's canned and finished. And of course we know that there's considerable more mystery in life, and nothing really makes sense if you think of nature as really made that way. For example, you don't need the DNA code in life because those atoms and molecules are already coded in the Hamiltonian of their motion, and they know where to go. They don't need any DNA to tell them. But the quantum says, no, there is a small but definite mystery to every interaction that takes place in nature. Small, but over time, it builds up. And it was the basis of a very important insight for the second of our lectures, which was about the nature of the essence of the quantum. The new thing that it introduced was the quantum wave function. And it is pure information. It's not mass, it's not charge, or any of the other properties of elementary particles. It is pure information which tells where to go. And that information is a spiritual-like entity. You can't get your hands on it. You can get your hands on the mass, on the matter. But what makes it go someplace, where it should go, is encoded in the wave function. And the wave function is not completely deterministic. It is got this little small piece of mystery. And like all great pieces of art, the essence of the universe and its creative energies is of the highest form of art because it relies, in some extent, on accident, on spontaneity, on something that you can't know ahead of time and only will come into being at that moment. So it's a very much, the universe is very much like all that we know about the finest art. It's an artistic creation. Now, given the quantum nature of matter, that if we're going to have some really complex interactions of molecules and atoms that make things like living creatures, that's going to push the bottom, and push that one. No.
Might just have to have a seat there.
Maybe you're going to have a seat there.
Exactly.
When we get to complex atoms and molecules, they can form really quite rich structures. And some of these structures are what we call life. And that aspect of evolution that is the whole mechanism of life is based on random mutations that take place in DNA. And those are random because of the quantum fluctuations in the atoms and molecules that code DNA, so that the message never stays exactly the same. It stays pretty much the same. If life is going to be stable, it has to do that. But it has randomness in it. Now, random hits a lot of people's ears in a kind of off-putting way. But you should really think of it, and I put a little equals signs, equals free. People often talk about everything is governed by God's plan. Well, if it's a plan, it's a done deal. And God is far better than that. It is the freedom in these molecular motions that makes it possible for new structures to arise and then work their way through natural selection and the whole dynamic of life. Now, the freedom of action in evolution, when we have complicated animals that can form societies, leads to a new level of freedom. And that is the subject of what we're going to talk about tonight. If the universe is determined and organisms are robots, then there is no moral universe, because what the moral universe is about is how organisms or animals that have some emotional system and mental capacity can organize and behave so that they form a social unit that doesn't just fall apart. So much of the animal world is social. Some of it is not. Some of it's pretty unsocial. But we are sitting in a place in the world of animals that is one of the most intensely social of all, enormously social. We can't even imagine existing without somebody else around. And we go crazy if we can't get on the cell phone and call, talk, hear the radio on. We are intensely needful of social interaction, because that's also what makes human society now spread over the whole earth. So, there is in social animals a need for a kind of shared understanding of what you can do because of this freedom. Not completely a robot. What you can do and what you shouldn't do, even though you could do it. And that's where morality comes in. And it's obviously one of the major subjects, and obviously very important in our time. And we'll say something about that as well. Now, our human moral behavior began with our social primate relatives. These happen to be chimpanzees. And these animals, you see, are gesturing, and that gesture is understood as a request for sharing food. And their request will be met, for the most part, by an agreement to give and to share. These animals will share with one another. And they get angry and might even punish an animal that doesn't. So these are the basic rudimentary beginnings. Now, the chimpanzee is a pretty sophisticated primate, but it really lacks a lot when it comes to the kind of capability that human intelligence has. It's a very, very pale precursor of it. So I'm going to now jump right away to the issue of human moral behavior. And the first thing I want to mention and talk about is what I call the rigidity moral dimension, and it's this. There is a way in which, when we are talking about moral behavior, we say, that is just plain wrong. I can't explain why it is, but I know it's wrong, and it should not be done, and human beings should not do that. We have a couple of several examples in our current social situation in which that is a mainstay of thought. And this pole of thought, which I call the absolute right and wrong pole. Let's see. Do you see a red dot any place?
No.
Do we still have the pointer?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. There we go.
Okay. So, we all have internalized a sense of absolute right and wrong. And that's part of our makeup. That's part of our evolved legacy. Let's try it.
All right.
All right. Okay. Temperature 79. This absolute right and wrong is one pole of how we're put together emotionally. There is another pole, which is actually in some ways contradictory to it, which is called utilitarian right and wrong. And I apologize for that name, but it was kind of coined in the 19th century. And the word utility appears because that understanding of moral behavior is based on the consequences, the utility of the act. Is it going to have good or bad consequences? So that's what the utility comes in. So there's a utilitarian idea of right and wrong, and an absolute idea of right and wrong. Next slide. So, the absolute right and wrong is simple. It's automatic. You just know it. People, when we appeal to that kind of right and wrong, it's automatic. You cannot hurt an innocent person. It's just plain wrong. And more particular to some of the issues of our day, you cannot abort a fetus. It is just plain wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Homosexual sex is absolutely wrong. There is no discussion involved. It's obviously wrong. So it's simple, automatic, and consequences are irrelevant. If you have an ectopic pregnancy and a baby is growing in the fallopian tube and the woman who is carrying this baby is starting to hemorrhage, you really need to remove that pregnancy if you're going to save her life. But there are some people who would argue, no, you don't kill a life to save a life. And if both the baby and the mother die, well, that's God's business. That's not our business. You don't kill that fetus. And it's too bad, but that's just the way it is. So consequences are irrelevant. The other thing is that absolute right and wrong is probably the oldest part of the brain, because you don't do any computing or computation or analysis. It's just there. And animals and human beings, in a way, would have a very hard time operating if they had to sit down and think about everything that they were going to do, especially in difficult or emotionally charged situations that involve life and death. And it's not surprising at all that nature has evolved us so that there is a kind of automatic operation of morality. Now, when we come to utilitarian right and wrong, like, well, maybe there's something not worthwhile in losing both a mother who has a couple of other children perhaps and who's now dying with an ectopic pregnancy. It's a shame to have to end that life, but it's better to do that than to let her perish as well. So it's a more complicated, it recognizes the complexity of moral situations. It involves deliberation. You have to think about it a little bit. And consequences are important. You can't just skip over the consequences. And it's newer. It probably, our sense of, in our operation of utilitarian right and wrong, probably has origins and starts to grow and flourish, I would say, at about the time of speech, about the time that we became capable of fairly complex speech. Next. Okay. I'm going to give some more examples of what I mean by absolute and utilitarian right and wrong, but I'm first of all going to introduce now a second dimension. This is not the same thing. We say morality is kind of complicated. It's got many dimensions to it. I'm actually only going to talk about two tonight. The first one was that rigidity dimension about absolute right and wrong and utilitarian right and wrong. Then another one that's very important and has only been opened up and explored, I would say, in the last 2 decades. And it has to do with impersonal and personal nature of moral situations. Next. So, what is personal morality? Personal morality, or a personal moral situation, a moral situation that has person very much in it, is one in which you directly lay hands on another person. You have to be physically close. You have to be personally ready to hurt or help that person. So physical contact, physical presence, actual physical action. And impersonal is you may indirectly act on another person, but you don't do it directly. You have a separation. You're separated out. I'm going to illustrate this now with 2 of the most famous problems in modern evolutionary psychology, which came into being in the last 20 years. It's called the trolley problem. And I'm going to first of all talk about the trolley switchback track problem. And here's the trolley problem. Some of you who have been to my lectures earlier might have heard this. There's a runaway trolley coming down the track. And you are standing and you see that there are 5 workmen who are working on the track and they don't see that it's coming. But you see that there is a switch in the track that can switch the trolley onto a side track and take it away from those workers. Unfortunately, there's a solitary man who's working on the side track. So if you throw the switch and send the trolley onto the side track, you will kill an innocent person, but you will have saved 5 others. Now, this problem has been given as a moral problem, hypothetical moral problem, all over the world, to both men and women and people of many different cultures and different religions. And to a significant majority, people say, well, sure, we don't want to hurt anybody, but if we have to, it's okay to throw the switch. Go ahead, you can throw the switch. Then there's the trolley footbridge problem. And it goes this way. Same situation, the trolley's out of control coming down the track. There are 5 workmen working on the track who don't see it. But you and a very big man are standing on a footbridge on the track overhead. And you see that if you shoved this very big man and he fell into the track, this little dinky trolley would get derailed and it wouldn't kill the 5 others. Now, this same problem has also been presented all over the world to many different cultures, different, both sexes, and many different religions. And people, to a significant majority, say, you cannot push that man off the bridge. So this is an illustration of personal versus impersonal morality. That's built into our emotional systems. And it has a lot of good features, that because when we really get up close to a person, we can't be so free about maybe our utilitarian morality, which is saving 5 other people. If I have to kill this person standing right in front of me, it's not so easy. So, here's our situation. We've got these 2 moral dimensions, and they are distinct from one another, yet they are slightly correlated. They have an impact on one another. Next. So, down here, the moral situation is very impersonal. And up here, it's intensely personal. At the place where you could lay hands on the person. And here we have absolute right and wrong. And over here we have the utilitarian right and wrong. Now, in the trolley footbridge, you are actually really laying your hands on that person, and your emotional system just won't let you easily. It's not that it absolutely won't, but it's not going to be easy to push that person off the bridge. So you're going to never push a person off a bridge is going to trump. It's going to control the situation. Even though you can say, but over here, utilitarian, if you would let us work over here, we could save 5 people. No, it wants to push you over here. On the other hand, when you're just going to throw the switch, you're not going to touch the person. You're just going to throw the switch. Our emotional systems will let us do that. And so the trolley switch track is over here. We want to be on the utilitarian right and wrong. We want to save 5 people. And we're now permitted to do that because it's freed us emotionally to do that. Next. Oh, I think you're going backwards. There we go. So, the typical moral universe that most of us live in wants to run along this sort of diagonal. If the situation is loaded with personhood, it's going to push us towards absolute right and wrong when you are going to have to harm that person, even if it's for a good purpose. And when we're not so loaded up personally, we're a lot freer to follow the utilitarian principle of let's save some lives. Next. I want to say more on this personal morality. The separation of the personal and the impersonal can be of 2 kinds. It can first of all be physical. We literally are physically separated. But human beings have brains that make it possible for us to actually be in the physical presence of other people, even close quarters, and not see them as persons. And in that case, there's an emotional separation. The emotional system does not recognize the other person emotionally as a person. I'll say a little bit more about that. So here's an example of physical separation. And this is the cockpit of a typical fighter jet. This is the universe you inhabit if you're a pilot in this aircraft. You're carrying a load of bombs. Maybe some of them have napalm in them. and this is your universe. Thanks. This is the effect of dropping those bombs. This is actually an event that happened, a very famous event that happened in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, in which a whole village of civilians were bombed with napalm because they were thought to be enemies. Well, actually they were, probably, although it's hard to think of this as the enemy. If that pilot had to see these children and push the button and drop the napalm on them, he wouldn't have been able to. But because of the physical separation that war machinery permits, it becomes possible. It releases that emotional bond. Next. So, that's the physical separation. Now, how about the emotional separation? Well, we have an area of the brain in the medial prefrontal cortex, and it's in this area, where we don't treat in terms of cognitive processing, where we are trying to distinguish something, orient it properly. If it's in motion, we're trying to still understand it while it's moving. All of these mechanical processes that we need for visual recognition and to say what it is that we're looking at. Are we looking at a snake? Are we looking at a piece of rope? Are we looking at a human being? Are we looking at a scarecrow? What is it? All of that processing has a very special part of the brain if there's a first recognition that it's likely human. If it's likely human, it sends these visual signals, and they could also be auditory, to a different part of the brain. And sometime if you want to test that out, if you take any ordinary object, like a book cover that has writing on it or something, and you turn it over, we're pretty good at reading upside down, actually. You try it, it takes a little bit of work, but you can do it. And objects, like flowers and other objects other than letters, we're pretty good at, because the brain has built-in processing power to reorient it for cognition. But if you take a human face and rotate it, it's really hard to recognize it. Take a very familiar face and turn it upside down. Very hard. And that's because it didn't go to that souped-up part of the brain that does geometric operations on inanimate objects or non-human objects. It sent it to a part of the brain that is for human recognition. And the reason for that is that there's a whole lot of other stuff that part of the brain is going to do other than get it right if it's upside down. So, and one of the things that part of the brain can do is recognize a person as a human being. But actually, it's almost like turning a switch. It goes into a location in memory that doesn't have the tag human on it. A tag that would bring forward, if you try to lay hands on that person, would say, stop, this is a human being, you can't do that. That switch is turned off. I'd like to illustrate that. So when that happens, when persons become objects in the brain, personal morality is changed into impersonal morality. And we come down on that chart, on the little two-dimensional graph, from personal, we drop down to impersonal. Let's have the next slide. These are Hungarian Jews in 1943 who are being prepared to be put on this train, and they're going to be sent to a concentration camp, and most of them are going to be killed. Now, it takes quite a crew of people to run a train, to pick people up in the city, to organize them into a caravan, to get them onto the train. This takes a lot of people. It probably takes almost as many people as you're putting on the train at any time. So there's an enormous infrastructure of human beings that have to process these people. Most of that infrastructure, most of the people, except for some rare exceptions, which you occasionally hear about, but most people will have that switch turned to off. These are not people. And in fact, context is really important for also reinforcing that understanding. If you notice the train that they're going to get on, this doesn't look like the kind of train people get on. These are not passenger cars. These are the kinds of cars that carry potatoes and sacks of onions and freight and occasionally cattle. So these people, to the brain of the ones who are getting them on the train and transporting them and getting them off, are like sacks of potatoes when it comes to the moral trigger and the moral tag that's on them. Next. So, if we go back to our little diagram here, we have these absolute right and wrong and utilitarian right and wrong. We can also, we had the trolley, two trolley problems that we can also now put load Jews into death trains. This is absolutely wrong. Everybody would agree it's absolutely wrong. But these aren't Jews. These are as far as the brain's registration of them, sacks of potatoes. Next. So I'd now like to tell you about one of the most important experiments that's ever been done in psychology. It was done in the 1960s, early 1960s, by Stanley Milgram, who was a really brilliant guy. And Milgram, of course, in 1960, we're not that far away from the Holocaust. It was still fresh in people's minds. And it was an obvious motivation for the research that Milgram wanted to do. He said, how do good, ordinary people physically harm and kill innocent people? How does it work? How do they morally manage it? So he said, let's try to find out. Next. Oops. Back up. So, these are more pictures from the deportation and attempted extermination of the Jews. Let's go ahead to the next slide. What I'm trying to point out here is some of the infrastructure. You see when these people arrived at Auschwitz, for example, in Poland, the women and children over here were separated out, and you see all these dark clothes over here. These are men. They're probably going to be sent to a slave labor camp for a while. But these women and children are going to the gas chamber. And although we see a few officers here, you know that there are lots of other people involved in this. Next. And these are the final results of what this is all about. And here we see there are people, there are workers who are doing their jobs.
Who are these people taking these pictures?
Germany.
Good question. I don't know.
Germany's not committed so much of that themselves.
Yeah. Next. So here's the Milgram experiment. Go ahead. So there appeared, Milgram was a professor at Yale. So there appeared in the New Haven newspaper an announcement: we will pay you $4 for 1 hour of your time. Persons are needed for the study of memory. So they need 500 people And they want factory workers, city employers, laborers, barbers, businessmen, clerks, professional people. They were covering the whole spectrum. They didn't just want college students. And you had to be between the age of 20 and 50. High school and college students cannot be used. And if you filled this out, you would get $4. Now, $4 in 1961 was probably like about $25 or $30, thinking. So lots of people were interested. And a lot of people were just interested in being able to participate in the experiment. Next. Well, the experiment to improve memory was actually an experiment to test the willingness to harm innocent people. And it involved teachers who were the volunteers that were being solicited. And it involved learners who were actors. And it involved a professor who was an actor. Now, this experiment got to be quite controversial at the time because it seemed to be not being straight with people. But the people who were entering the experiment were not, when you do a psychological experiment, you understand you're not going to get all the details, otherwise the experiment is all biased and won't work. But it did cause a lot of controversy, and it was the cause of Milgram losing a chance to get tenure at Harvard. After the experiment was done, people saw what a brilliant experiment he was promptly and adequately recognized for it. Okay, so here's how the experiment works. So we're trying to teach people to memorize word pairs. So you read down a list of word pairs. The teacher, here's the teacher. Now this is the one who's the actual volunteer. The learner is an actor, and the professor is an actor. But the teacher thinks they're all volunteers, thinks these guys are volunteers just as much as he was, or she was. And the learner communicates by intercom, and the teacher has a panel to deliver electric shocks if the learner gets the word wrong and misses them, because you're trying to improve the memory. So one of the ideas is that, well, if you maybe penalize people, they'll start to remember better. So it would start off with 15 volts when there was a wrong answer, and then it would go to 30, 45, all the way up to 450 volts. Now, a lot of people are not knowledgeable about electricity, and so they wouldn't necessarily know. But there were a couple of electrical engineers who answered the request, and they knew that 450 volts can be lethal. And the volunteers, who were the teachers here, were told that it was hurtful, but they weren't told that it was lethal. That was left slightly vague. So the results are as follows. First of all, there was a lot of distress in these experiments. People were very distressed. They were sweating. They several times said, you know, I got to quit. I can't do this. I don't want to do this. And the professor would say, please continue the first time. And then if they finally said, no, I can't do this, well, then it was the experiment requires that you continue. Interesting how the experiment has the capacity to require. And then 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice. You must go on. And people would, in various degrees, continue. So, next. So out of many trials with like over 500 people, many, many different tests, over half of volunteers delivered the shocks all the way up to 450 volts. Wow. And in one of the experiments, 37 out of 40. And the way the experiment dealt with this sort of fuzzy region is that when they started getting up in the high voltage region, the person wouldn't answer within the allotted time. And the teacher would say, well, you know, what should I do? He said, you know, you're supposed to treat the lack of an answer as false, as a miss. So they would raise the voltage. And then there would be no response. And several times people would say, have we killed him? And the professor would just say, well, it can be very painful, but it shouldn't cause any permanent damage. But the electrical engineer guy said, you're crazy. So the other thing that's interesting is some of the experiments were run where there were several teachers with their learners that they could all see each other. And the actors would actually sort of squeal when they were shocked. They would say, ouch. And they also ran a series where the actor was just in one room and he'd say, let me out of here. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to get out of here. And the experiment would still go on. In the group experiment, when it got to the very stressful levels of high voltages, if one person said, you can take your experiment, I don't want to have any more to do with this, and walk out, that would prompt many others to also get up and walk out. So if one would refuse, then it would prompt several others to do this. Next. So how do we do it? How do ordinary people harm innocent people? It's a really rich subject. There's a lot more to it. There's another dimension that I haven't put up yet, which is also important. It's whether we regard people as friends or part of our tribe, part of our race, part of our group, or whether they're outsiders who in fact, in the worst case, are enemies, but are people who are threatening and could hurt us. Now, we have a switch in the brain for that, too. And a lot of that excuses a lot of really nasty behavior. Do I have one more here? So, how do we do it? We transform personal morality into impersonal morality by giving up our freedom to an authority. In this case, not only does the learner become just an object in the experiment, the teacher becomes an object, and no longer a human being with a free will. The professor, the people who organized this experiment, the university, the authorities, people who know more, know better. This is their baby. I'm just doing my job. So this is a further twist on the personal and the impersonal of the fighter pilot and those that he napalms. This is one where the person committing the act has lost some of their humanity. And that's how it works. That's how it works. It's the impersonal, personal activation in the brain brought about by the existence of an authority that allows you to hand it off, allows you to throw that switch. Next. So, we can add one more to our chart here. Trolley footbridge, trolley switch tracks over here. We've got a lot of stuff down here because the impersonal allows us deliver lethal shocks, load Jews into death trains, and so on, even though we know it's absolutely wrong to do that. I noticed as I was making this little chart that we don't have much up here in situations that are highly personal, and yet there's a utilitarian issue. But I think our present era on the issue of abortion kind of fits up there. Because no one wants abortion to be. Nobody is in favor of abortion. But in the complexity of human life, there are situations where it is probably better to take the life of the fetus. Now that's utilitarian thinking. And it can be highly personal. And did any of you read Cider House Rules?
Oh, yeah.
It's a John Irving novel that sort of took on the issue of abortion and humanized just how complex and it is. So Cider House Rules maybe sits up there in that corner, where we do have an intensely personal situation, but yet we're willing to be utilitarian about it. Next. So can ordinary citizens of modern democracies like America commit immoral acts such as torture in the 21st century? And the Holocaust is well behind us, but this is Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. These are American soldiers. We'll just go through these quickly. I just wanted to mention that. You've probably seen these. How do we do it? How do ordinary people harm other human beings? Now, I mentioned that there's more dimensions to this problem. It's a complex subject. But I think just in trying to stretch out these two things about utility and absoluteness and impersonal and personal, whether it's emotional separation or whether it's real physical separation, we get some insight that we didn't have before. And it also shows us that morality is multidimensional. Often when you just say, well, morality is all about the Ten Commandments, just look at the Ten Commandments and do them. It's a very one-dimensional, it's a very simplified and simple-minded notion of morality. And as we see, it doesn't really work. It's not a bad thing, it's just incomplete. It's like taking all the other dimensions out and throwing them away and just keeping one of the dimensions, like utilitarian and absolute right and wrong. The other dimension that Abu Ghraib raises is the one I alluded to briefly, which is the enemy one. There's no doubt that we made a very big turning point, at least for 20th century America, when the government began torturing people after 9/11. And it was even had elements of the big lie, which the Germans used, which government officials, the president, George Bush, stood up and said, "We do not torture. This is not torture. What you are looking at there is not torture. This is enhanced interrogation." But there is something in people, and I gave a talk on torture here at the Homestead 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago maybe. It was about the time Abu Ghraib came into being. And there were people who said, well, but these are enemies. These are people who tried to kill us. They want to hurt us. That is that flips the switch. All of these people want to try to kill us. But for some people, that will work. That takes care of it. I don't like it. And you can see that the absolute part of that graph I showed you, that's still weighing on the people who are saying they're our enemies, they tried to kill us. Because they look at these pictures and they see, no way, this is not right. But they can't let it go because that other switch is saying they're enemies. They're in tension. I mean, it's like the Milgram people sweating and upset and distressed and yet pushing the button. Or in some cases saying, take your experiment, I'm not going to be part of it. So there's a third dimension. Maybe if I give this talk again sometime, I'll make it a three-dimensional presentation. Because I think that's a very important one. Once you have the enemy switch, boy, that just opens the floodgate to all the things that you can do. I think that's it. That's all I have to say. And we can now have a discussion if you'd like. Was this pretty understandable? It wasn't too abstract?
No,
wasn't too much like physics?
Hey, David, I stayed awake.
I was wondering how you quantify that.
What's that?
That was a joke. I was wondering how do you quantify all this? There's no,
Well, psychologists have these tests.
There was no mathematics up there.
No, but as far as your tolerance of utilitarian morality versus your tolerance, your urge to preserve absolute morality, there are tests for that. There are definitely tests for that. And I think it's honestly true that some of us are wired very strongly towards that absolute morality. And because of the multitude of switches, it gets very confused. I have a very dear friend who I went to school with. We've known each other all our lives. He's a very devout Catholic, a very nice and very wonderful guy. But he is crazy about anti-abortion. He is just, abortion, he just thinks it's the most terrible thing that's happening in the world. It's got to be stopped. And he's an anti-abortion crusader. And so when I raised the issue about torture, or about, you said, there's no circumstance that ever allows killing a fetus. But yet you permit endless circumstances to kill full-throated human beings who are not in process of becoming something, who are not quarter a human being or half a human being or three-quarters. They're full human beings. You say that that's okay. You said, well, we have to defend ourselves.
A fetus is defenseless there.
Excuse me?
A fetus is defenseless. That human being over there is not defenseless. That fully grown human being.
The fully grown human being is not defenseless.
That person is not defenseless, but a fetus is defenseless.
So you let it come into the world and grow up to be a full-grown baby, and then call it an abortion.
Yeah,
same thing, you just did it 25 years later.
20 years later.
Well, my dear friend Donna Zilborg disagrees with me on this point, but I was saying, why is it that people are so willing to kill a fetus, or not willing, who will defend it,
With the death penalties.
but are willing to kill full-grown, full-blooded human beings? And I said I thought it was really because of the fact that competitive warfare is one of the legacies of human evolution. We evolved in tribes that found that if you tried to compete and attack and drive out other tribes, and they were doing the same to you, that you got into this cycle, and that's why it's there. And I said, you need warriors. So don't kill the children. But enemies, mow them down. Get rid of them.
Well, it's just like, we have prohibitions against dropping bombs on civilian populations. But, we'll drop bombs on an army base, But how many warriors are there in the civilian, in the city too, in the urban city, that we say, oh no, don't drop a bomb there.
Purely just. What about the bombing of Dresden and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Those were not military targets.
Yeah, well, that was then. This is now. We're talking about nowadays. That was 60-some years ago.
They sent in a drone to knock out supposedly some terrorists, and they killed a dozen civilians in the same.
What if they really are? What if they really are Taliban? They really are Taliban. They're Taliban, and they got all their wives and children in there with them. What I think is more fundamental here is the evolution of civility is very uneven across the world. It has a little bit to do with development, quite a bit to do with development, in fact. Development, education, scientific progress, all of these things. But until a few years ago, there were still people living as hunter-gatherers, 200,000-year-old understanding of how you behave. And Afghanistan and many parts of the world still are living in that kind of environment in which, in the Bible, in Numbers 22, Moses tells the Israelites that they are to kill every one of those Hittites, the men and the women and the children, and go back and kill the women and the children because you didn't do it right the first time, and God now is telling you to do it right. So these things are very much a part of our legacy. Of course, at a time when all the tribes of the world have spread out, flowed over the globe, all the races have discovered one another and have bumped into each other, this is no longer a feasible way. To use an evolutionary word for it, it's maladaptive. You keep going, you keep operating this way, which was very good for you 200,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 500 years ago. It's no good today. And that's an important lesson that we're trying to learn. And it's not easy because all that programming in the brain is ancient. It doesn't update itself easily.
It's an amazing phenomenon that we have become such a successful creature because of our dominance in different parts of the world. But there are some peoples that were not annihilated by the powerful, and it would be of interest to see how their DNA or structure as far as social behaviors.
Do you have some examples? Or?
Well, the ones that I can think of are like sand people, the desert people in Africa, bush people that were isolated, so isolated, Eskimos, people that were in the least attractive environments to not attract a dominant culture to come and destroy them and destroy their culture and identity and their physical makeup as well.
They would be interesting. Some of
the primitive peoples that live in the most remote places may have a cultural identity in their genetic structure after not having had the violent, competitive, dominant thing.
Not all hunter-gatherer or primitive tribes are non-violent.
No,
most of them are violent.
Yeah, and that's for sure. But the very few that exist still in a natural state, or as far as we can tell, avoided domination. Sentinel Islands people near Indonesia, the ones that flagged off the help when the people came to help them after the tsunami. Those people were imprisoned as slaves, and by passing ships in historical times. So they had every reason to stay isolated, and they were in a place where they could be isolated. And those type rare instances would be interesting to see if their culture has a free, accepting nature that doesn't force them like us to go dominate and take and steal and pillage. We definitely have that inbred in us in this culture, in the Western European heritage, and even the dominated cultures. It absolutely amazes me that the slave population in this country, the Indian population, they're Christians. And they were beat on and annihilated and decimated by Christians. It doesn't make sense.
Oh, that's typical of.
Yeah, they're forced into it.
Yeah.
But we, we inherited all of that, and we're wise enough to know what the history really was, and we just happen to go along with this Christian idea that is just, Muslims as well, and the other dominant world cultures have a history of the same type. Like I said, it bears truth that we inbred our combatant nature so thoroughly.
Well, we are capable of learning.
Right, that's where we're at now, I think. And the ball has to switch where the education and learning has to replace the medieval concepts of ethnicity, religion, and politics. And they seem unsurmountable in the world today. The way things are still driving. But education is the hope for the world, I think.
It's very mysterious how the movement towards a more civil humanity takes place. Because coming from where I come from, to me, it's very important to try to understand what's going on and to try to make some act or to respond in a way that's fruitful. And so, to me, it's important to know a lot about the dynamics between men and women, for example, just the evolved legacy that we come into being with. In understanding the whole transformation of the women's movement. This is a major, major thing. This is a very big deal. But I don't think the women's movement happened because people studied anthropology and studied. It came out of experience. It came out of just living and saying, I don't want to live this way. There wasn't any analysis. There wasn't any study of the male and female brains and emotional systems. But if you do study them, they are very revealing about why we are the way we are. They tell us a lot about why things are the way they are. But the actual dynamic of change, it didn't seem to involve the education at all, as far as I could tell. At least education on the specific subject of how the male and female emotional systems are put together as far as understanding the women's movement. So we may be learning, but we're learning out of experience and acting accordingly from what we actually bump into and experience.
Right.
And that's the same course of the movement to get gay marriage endorsed across the country. It's through young people's experience now who have had much more experience encountering gay couples and committed relationships and things. And the fear is dissipating, amongst people.
Yes, and I think it would be helpful if, contrary to the way some people think about it, they say, well, you just look at human male and female sexuality. What are you talking about? The same sex having sex together, it's goofy. This is not how you make children. It's crazy. It's wrong. But actually, human sexuality evolved with a strong capacity for physical bonding. That kind of physical contact created bonding relationships and infused the relationship with a vitality and a kind of nourishment that the non-sexual relationship did not have. And that emotional machinery is as much in human beings as fertilizing eggs. It got there because it takes a lot to bear and raise a human child. It takes an enormous amount of resources and work and effort. And so nature bonds people together to get the work done. But I think of it a little bit like the ear, which our ear is actually the jawbone of a fish. And you would say, well, this is contra natura. This is against nature. This is an ear. This is not a jawbone of a fish. Well, it evolved from the jawbone of a fish. And human social relationships, for which the binary relationship still seems to be the strongest. If the emotional preparation was laid because of the natural need to bond people together for the difficult and time-consuming and energy-consuming task of bringing a human child to adulthood, if nature created these strong emotional bonds, maybe they can be used for other things that don't involve procreation, that bond people together in a fruitful relationship, that makes their lives productive together and nurturing and so on. So it's a big error when the Pope says that sex exists for procreation. Well, actually, the emotional machinery that is built around sex is much bigger than procreation. In the same way, you would say, stop listening with your ear. That's a jawbone. You're abusing your ear. You're a pervert. Well, maybe we should have...
Oh, you were just getting into the good parts, talking about sex. And then well,
you want to add?
We're off right here. Yeah. Don't start me. We'll be here all
right. Well, I'd like to crank you up because I think that the female-male relationship in all the dominant cultures is something that is inbred selectively, and that is an issue that
female-male.
Female. Well, it's really male dominance.
Yeah, patriarchy
throughout all the dominant cultures in the world.
There really just doesn't make any sense to think that there was a pure and wonderful time when females were dominant, and there's just no evidence for that at all.
Right. And
all of the genetics, all of the dynamics, all of the ways the emotional systems are put together, it is a dominant male. That's our humanity.
Right.
Up to this point.
Right. And some education.
But the present is we're living in a very wild time. More than half, both undergraduates and graduate students now, I believe, are women. I don't know if you look, do you know many 20-something men, or 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old men? Lots of my compatriots have grandchildren in that age group, including my dear Anna. These men seem lost. She has a granddaughter who is about to graduate with a med degree from BU. There are other young women who are into law, they're oceanographers, and there are men, but young men seem to be kind of lost.
Right, that's part of the picture. The dominance and abuse is universal. And it's something that's a dynamic that hopefully will change across the board. We think we are in a pretty liberal, equitable society of a sort, which we're not, but there's others that
it's better.
So much worse. It's better, yes.
It's better.
And like you said,
I didn't see anybody hanging from a lynch tree as I came up the mountain, but 100 years ago I might have.
It's because they know how to hide it better now.
Well, you know, there are other ways of manifesting inequality.
Right.
But one of the questions we had a visit from somebody who's been very active in combating racism, and she's a white person and she's interacting with an interracial group in Greensboro. And I said, Mary Kay, if the country were 86% black and 14% white, don't you think the prisons would be full of young white men? And she said, well, no. Well, I believe they would be. Because in all cultures and in all places where you look at the situation of a very big majority population, like 85%, that's a big. The majority oppresses the minority. It goes on in Iran, it goes on in Saudi Arabia, it goes on in China, it goes on in Tibet, it goes on in Russia. It goes on everywhere. It's not just white-black. It's, you know, if you're Tibetan and all the Han Chinese have moved in and have taken over the province, it's a little different than bringing people as slaves on boats. But pretty soon you've got a minority population and a majority that's lording it over them.
It's like the Sunnis don't like the Shiites don't like the Sunnis, and they both look down on the Kurds, but they're all Muslims.
You know the Muslim or the Afghan saying, me against my brothers. My brothers and me against our cousins. Me, my brothers, and our cousins against the world.
That's so sobering.
But I understand they've got TV in Afghanistan now, and they're never going back to the Taliban when they said you can't watch TV, because even the Taliban need to watch the next episode of the soap opera.